Hello and welcome to Bare Marriage. I'm Rebecca Lindenbach, and do not worry, you will be hearing from Sheila in just a minute. She is currently still on vacation / doing meetups in New Zealand and Australia. So if you are in Australia, make sure you check out the Facebook page for some events so that you don't miss up a meetup if there's one in your area. Today's podcast is going to be a fantastic conversation with Laura Anderson about when church hurts. But first, I have two quick things to talk about with you. First of all, our survey is still live and we still want your participation. If you are someone who is currently married and at least one of you in your marriage is a Christian, please check out the link in the show notes and you'll be able to take that survey, help us with our research, and we really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who's already filled it out. We've had a lot of you. And I'm really excited to see what we're going to find. And of course, December means that Christmas is right around the corner, something that my 4-year-old is very excited by and that I am slightly overwhelmed by, but also excited by. And if you're looking for Christmas presents for people, for stocking stuffers, we have tons of stuff in our merch store. If you order by December 10th, Printify says that it will be there by Christmas. Okay, they're the people who fulfill all of our merch orders, who print all the stuff out, who make it all look so great. There are 2 whole new merch designs available right now. The Science Rocks one, celebrating that we as Christians do not need to be afraid of research and science, but rather the more that we delve into truth, the more we reveal the one who is the author of truth. So we love that one. It was also done by me and Joanna. And then also the Jezebel Club ones for all those women who call out injustice online and immediately get called a Jezebel by men who are mad that we're telling them that, yay, maybe women shouldn't be abused. As well, we've created some bundles so you can get 2 hoodies with the biblical manhood and biblical womanhood roles on them. So a him and her package deal, you'll get a bit of a discount. And we've also brought back the Love and Respect merch line for this Christmas, including his and hers mugs saying, I'm a man and I need love, and I'm a woman and I need respect too. So yes, please do check out our merch store. We are going to have a link for that in the show notes, of course. And just a reminder that, again, this weekend is the deadline to when it'll be guaranteed to show up for Christmas, okay? December 10th. Well, I think that was all I was supposed to tell you. So without further ado, enjoy this interview with Sheila and Laura.
I am so happy to bring on the Bare Marriage podcast today, Laura Anderson, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist. Y'all know how much I like the word licensed there. And she also has a PhD in mind-body medicine. So Dr. Anderson, Laura, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It is really good to be here.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I read your book last week. I read it Wednesday. I thought it was amazing. So here we are. We are here to talk about your new book, When Religion Hurts You, because I think this is a theme that a lot of my podcast listeners can relate to, is, you love God so much, and he's so much a part of your life. He's your entire identity. And then things happen in church spaces, which end up causing trauma. And it's awful. It's really, really awful. And
absolutely.
You've walked this. I've walked this. So many of our listeners have walked this. So we're going to unpack this today and talk about what trauma is. So I have a whole bunch of quotes I want to read, but I'm going to start with one at the very beginning of the book where you were talking about how you were in a counseling situation. You're a licensed marriage and family therapist. You're seeing all these people. And you said, on top of everything, many of my clients reported physiological and psychological symptoms consistent with trauma, extreme stress, and shame, all of which mere cognitive shifting couldn't help. So you're seeing all these people and the normal therapies aren't working. So tell me about that.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been a therapist for 15 years now, and it's been so wonderful to see, even just in the last 15 years, how the field of trauma has really advanced and our understanding of trauma with that. So I think about, when I was in school, it's hey, we got one trauma and crisis course that heavily focused on crisis instead of trauma. And it was mostly cognitive behavioral or trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy that we talked about, but we weren't really even trained in it. And so many of the modalities that were being used were mostly cognitively based, or what we might call the in vivo exposure. So you gradually expose yourself to whatever the threat is, and then your body is supposed to calm down and you're supposed to be fine. But as more research has been done, as people's lives have been observed, we know that that's not, in fact, how trauma lives in the body. And the research has just kind of been lagging behind. But in the last 15 to 20 years, we've started to see the research head more into a body-based direction in regard to understanding that trauma does not just live in your mind. You can't think it away, but it actually lives in your body, and there's physiological responses.
Okay, hold on a second. Hold on a second.
Yes.
We need to say that again. You need to say that again.
Yeah.
Okay, so trauma
Yeah.
doesn't just live in your mind.
You cannot think it away.
You
Trauma
can't
lives in our
think it away.
bodies.
Yes.
Yeah. You can't think it away. It would be so nice, right? It would, if trauma did live in our mind, if it was stored in our brain, essentially what would happen is our brain could time and date stamp it and say, that's in the past, so we're good. We are present, we're good, and just keep moving along. But so many of us know from lived experience that that is not what happens, where we'll be triggered or we have these physiological responses where we're like, where was that coming from? That happened years ago, and yet I feel like I'm back there now. Those observations and many more led to a lot of research being done to understand, okay, it doesn't seem like if we just think better, then trauma goes away. So what is trauma actually? And it is a nervous system or physiological response to anything that's too much, too fast, too soon, kind of overwhelms our ability to cope and come back to a place of safety. And so trauma is very subjective then. What is traumatic for you may or may not be for me. It's perceptive. It doesn't matter if there's an actual threat in front of us. It could be simply the perception of threat. And then it's embodied. Going back to that point, it lives in our body, not in our mind. And so our brain is very helpful for trauma and trauma recovery. But in terms of resolving how that lives in us, we have to look at the body. And that's where we start to see a lot of those physiological symptoms. It's where I started to see physiological symptoms in myself, in my clients, in my colleagues, in my friends, of going, hey, yeah, like you may have left this belief system or this harmful church or this maybe some spiritually abusive leadership or whatever it might be, but your body is still responding as if it's back in that environment, which really correlates to what the research is saying about trauma and really how it's a physiological experience instead of a cognitive one.
Yeah, I just find this fascinating. I think people really need to understand this. You're not doing it to yourself. Like, your body has stored this, and we need to find a way to work through it. So, okay. So two big things. And when religion hurts you, two big things that are different in the work that you're doing. And what's so cool about this book, and you talk about this early, is first of all, you're not anti-religious. So most people who write about religious trauma and who have written in journals and this has been a main part of their focus, are coming at it as religion is a bad thing. Christianity is a bad thing. And you're not like that. Like, you're not doing that. You're not anti-religious. You're just
no. Yeah, I don't find that to be helpful, because I feel like for so many people coming out of high control religion or spiritually abusive environments, we're looking at dynamics of power and control. We're looking at a lot of prescription, right? You do this, you believe this, you say this, you don't do this. And if we kind of go like, okay, well, all religion is bad, and in order to heal from religious trauma, you must be an atheist, we're really kind of doing the same thing, just on the other side of the spectrum. I don't think that that's healing. And again, that's really just only hitting your brain. That's saying, okay, just believe in a different way and then you'll be fine. Well, we know that's not true. And I think healing's not prescriptive like that, right? Yeah. We just say, throw this away and do this, and then you'll be fine. No, that's not helpful. I know there's some people that have found that maybe atheism is what fits for them, but there's so many people that would say, I don't want to have to throw away these beliefs or these practices or this God that I hold so dearly to me. And so is there a way to heal religious trauma without that? And I would say, absolutely. Yeah, there is.
Yes. The way that I always put it is, you're not allowed to steal Jesus from me.
Sure. Yeah. As a therapist, it's never my job to tell you what to do or what to believe, or that you have to land at a specific spot. My goal in working with the clients that I work with is I want to help you lean more into what is important to you. And so if you say, hey, here is what works for me, then great. Let's incorporate that. Let's make sure that you are incorporating that into your life in the way that is the most meaningful and valuable to you. And I think that that's what has been missing in treatment, prior to the last 5-10 years or so.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's one thing. You're not anti-religious. And the second one, which I really like, is that you sort of have a new definition of healing. That it isn't some place that you arrive at, but that it's more like, the sanctification process on earth, where we're always changing. We're always becoming more aware. We're always ripping off more layers and more layers and more layers and getting, closer to the essence or whatever. But it isn't something where one day we will have arrived and it will never bother us again.
Yeah. When we, what I found, and really my own life was kind of the impetus for understanding healing in a different way, because when I had a very specific definition of like, okay, to be healed means I look like this, I feel like this, I think like this, I talk, walk, dress, whatever. It was very, very definite. And anything outside of that, in my mind, didn't count. So it didn't matter if I had different relationships or responded differently, because I wasn't at this point of arrival. In my mind, I felt like this doesn't really count. This isn't what healing is. And so because of that, I missed all the ways that I was actually healing. But because it wasn't this idea out here, it actually started to feel quite confusing and discouraging. And even there was a lot of shame connected to that too. A lot of like, why isn't this result happening? I'm working so hard to get to this and nothing is working. And so my dissertation chair was wonderful and kind of just gently nudged me along to say like, what if that, definition of healing is a bit limited? And I didn't like it, because in some ways it made me go, I might have to give up this picture of what I think healing or being healed looks like. But when I allowed myself to just lean in, almost like try it on like a piece of clothing for size to see like, how does this fit? It actually opened up kind of my eyes to going like, wow, I do see though that I've actually come a very far way, and each one of these moments do count. They do matter. And if I don't count this, then I kind of miss all of life around me. If I'm just only going to this goal, then I'm not able to see kind of the rest of life and relationships and it's not really living. I really like it's just kind of like moving as fast as you can through life and not really living and being present. And so that was really helpful to be able to say like, hey, I think the point of healing is to actually live. And so when we take that definition of like healed with the period, end of sentence off, it means that every moment does count. It means when we set a boundary, or when we use our voice in a different way, or we can notice when we're triggered and we respond in a different way. Those are all moments of healing and should be celebrated and should be seen as such. And so I think that that's really fit for me. And my clients like begrudgingly, they're like, oh, I don't know. I kind of want to just be done and be healed. And it's like, well, I get that. I do. But if we can kind of give ourselves permission to open that up, it gives us the ability really truly to be present in our lives and to celebrate each moment that we are doing something different.
Yeah, I love that. That's so great.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on to religious trauma in a minute. But before we do that, I do want to just dive down into what trauma is. You've explained it a little bit, but just because I know it can be really confusing to a lot of listeners. So one of the things that I really appreciated, you have whole chapters on like what trauma does, and even the you explain trauma in the brain and so well. There's not a lot of people that do like neurology and really well, but you said that trauma isn't necessarily an incident that happens to you. Trauma is instead how we experience things.
Yes.
So can you explain that?
Yeah, the little kind of quippy phrase that I'll use is that trauma is not the thing that happens to us, but the way that our body or our nervous system responds to the thing that happens to us. So trauma, I said this a couple of moments ago, trauma is anything that's too much, too fast, too soon. It overwhelms our nervous system's ability to cope and come back to a place of safety. And so that means that if something happens that kind of overwhelms us and we never are able to kind of get our feet back on the ground to feel safe, that trauma energy, and I don't mean like woo-woo energy, I mean like adrenaline, cortisol, hormones kind of coursing through our body that our bodies are created to make, to mobilize when we feel like we are in danger, that gets stuck in our bodies. And if we don't have a way to unstuck that, or in trauma terms, kind of complete the trauma cycle, that's where it over time can become trauma, PTSD, CPTSD, or other physical or mental health disorders. The same is true then with, well, I should back up and say that is very subjective from person to person. So we are all different in terms of our DNA and other genetic factors, our environments, our connections, all of these factors that are often very subconscious. We don't consciously decide what is happening. They're just kind of happening beneath the surface, help determine how something kind of lands on us, right? And that's then kind of what can transition us into the impact of it and ultimately could be traumatic or not.
Yeah, exactly. And it's why, you think about World War I when they were just starting to understand shell shock is what they called it back then, how, what your buddy would have it, but you wouldn't, even though you went through exactly the same thing.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
that's why the trauma as subjective is so important, even when we're talking religious trauma, because there are many siblings, for instance, that grow up in the same home, and how one person was impacted is different than the other. That doesn't mean that one is better or worse, stronger or weaker. It just means that we are different. Our bodies are different. And so the impact is as well.
Right. And how is small T trauma different from big T trauma?
Yeah, so that was a way that psychologists, researchers decided to kind of categorize trauma. I don't particularly love it, but I get it. I understand it psychologically speaking. So traditionally, when we look at big T trauma, it's what we would call single incident trauma. And then small T trauma is what we might call complex trauma, or would fit more into the CPTSD categories. Single incident trauma, or big T, is exactly what it sounds like, an incident. This thing happens. So there's a before, the thing happens, and then there's an after.
Right.
And so oftentimes when we're doing trauma work, in some ways it's quote unquote easy, because there's some very specific events that we are resolving how that is living in your body, as opposed to what is called small T trauma or complex, in which it's a lot of things that are happening that are over time, consistent, persistent, maybe inescapable, things that are kind of grating at your identity, your safety, your sense of stability, and how you navigate through this world. And so when we go back to resolve that and are recovering from that more complex trauma, it's not necessarily that we can point to one big thing and say, oh, that's the thing that happened to me. It's usually a pervasive sense of threat and overwhelm for a long period of time. And that's usually where religious trauma fits, is in that category.
Yeah. And then people find themselves saying things like, I have no reason to feel this triggered. Like nothing really happened to me. And I know I think I'm in that boat too. Like it's not anything bad. Like it's not anything huge that you can point to, but just, that there's something wrong.
Yeah. Yes.
I wanted to read this bit about complex trauma that you have on page 36, where you're talking about the 4 different trauma responses, right? So we know the first two people tend to know fight or flight, but there's another 2. There's also freeze and there's fawn. And so here's what you said. If our nervous system determines that we can't fight or flee, it moves to fawning or freezing responses. A person with a fawning response lives in a state of needing to please, appease, or submit to avoid danger or punishment. A person with a freezing response often dissociates, becoming small, silent, and a non-participant in their life. It only takes a couple of attempts at fleeing or fighting to realize that it's safer to fawn or freeze. Treating complex trauma is hard because in many cases there's not one specific overwhelming incident. Yeah, and that's
Mhm.
what happens to so many of us is we find ourselves, yeah, like
Mhm.
I am totally a fawner or I'm
Yeah.
totally a freezer. I've disassociated. I
Mhm.
don't have a voice anymore.
Mhm.
Um, so why is it if we know if we kind of understand what complex trauma is, it's just the sum total of all of these things that are overwhelming us. They're too much, too soon, too fast, and our
Mhm.
bodies can't keep up. Why does religion do that to us? What is it
Mm.
about religion that can
Yeah.
cause complex trauma like that?
Yeah, there's a variety of things. And I always want to be careful to say, like, I don't believe that religion in and of itself is traumatizing, just
No.
like I don't believe anything is traumatizing, right? Like you
Yeah.
said, even with war, shell shock, right? One person can walk away relatively unaffected, and the other one is deeply affected. So I want to be careful because I do think that some people do tend to pathologize religion, or they'll say things like it's for a weak minded person, or
Mhm.
you're always going to end up with such and such disorder within religion. I don't believe that to be the case. I think that's a very ignorant way to describe things. But in terms of like why or how could religion end up as the kind of preemptive feature for trauma? So we're talking about, I use a term in the book, high control religion. And so these
Mhm.
are often systems that are built on dynamics of power and control, which is usually patriarchal, where we've got a person or people at the top that are dictating the rules for living. And that's everything from, the way to what you're supposed to do and wear and dress and who you can be in relationship with, all the way down to it can be here's the type of information that you are allowed to seek out or listen to. Or maybe there is some harm, abuse that's been done, but no, we handle that in house. We don't let you go out and get a therapist or a lawyer or, talk to the police. It could be things like having demands of your time, energy, money, resources, very rigid, narrow definitions of gender and sexuality that you must live by. And all of this is kind of covered over in the umbrella of God, and
Mhm.
because God said so, right? And so one of the things in the back of my book, there's the religious power and control wheel, and we'll oftentimes see like, oh, well, that happens or this happens or whatever, and they're seemingly benign or small or whatever type behaviors or
Mhm.
things that are happening. But over time, as those things build up on themselves, what we see is they start to really truly gain a sense of power over people to the point where it's like my authenticity, my identity, who I am, I cannot show up. I have to fragment myself. I have to cut myself off in order
Mhm.
to survive in this system. Now, the other piece of that is there's a lot of warning for outside of the system. So if you leave,
Mhm.
you'll be disconnected from your friends and family. If you leave, we will give you over to the devil and he can
Mhm.
have his way with you. If you leave, what are you going to do? Because you don't have any education or training or ways to earn money for your family, like
Mhm.
very real things. And what that does is it increases the amount of power over you. Now, I certainly don't want to suggest that always leads to trauma. It doesn't. But when we start to see these tiny, what are seemingly tiny or small or insignificant things that are coming on over time, increasing and have consequence, that's where we start to see that they can really become inescapable, persistent, overwhelming. And that's where we do oftentimes have to engage in behaviors like fighting or flighting, or for women and children in particular, fawning and freezing. Those become the safest ways to kind of live out of that fawning or live out of that freezing in order to survive a situation like that.
Yeah. It is,
Mhm.
as I was reading it on page 41, 42, you have a bunch of different examples of things that can be religious abuse that
Mhm.
are often, the catalyst for people experiencing trauma. And I'm reading through
Mhm.
this, and I think so many of us have experienced these things in churches, and we
Mhm.
shouldn't have. Um,
Mhm.
intimidation, making people feel
Mhm.
afraid, by using actions and gestures that could suggest disconnection from the community, teaching people
Yeah.
they deserve eternal conscious torment if they don't behave exactly as you want them to. Emotional abuse, making individuals feel bad about themselves, calling them names like worthless or sinner, publicly or privately humiliating them for mistakes or acts deemed sinful. I think about the women who have told me that, um, the church would invite women who were pregnant outside of marriage up to the front of the church to apologize,
Yes.
that kind of
Yeah.
thing. I've heard that from a lot of women.
So many. Yeah.
Isolation, requiring individuals to have relationships only with people within the religious system. And I think especially when it comes to counseling, going for help for depression and
Yes.
mental health and being told,
Yeah.
don't go see a doctor because doctors, don't believe in the right thing and don't understand
Yeah.
it's a spiritual problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, patriarchal privilege, treating women, children, and other marginalized individuals as lesser than or subservient, placing men over you. And there's so many other ones. But as you read this, it's like the church shouldn't be like this, and it doesn't need to be like this. None of this
Yeah.
is of Jesus. None
Mm-hmm.
of this looks anything like
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah.
But this is
Yeah.
so much what so many of our churches
Mm-hmm.
have become.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so one of the projects that you were involved in, which I think is really interesting, is the adverse religious experiences scale. So
Mm-hmm.
that which you kind of based off the ACE. So what is the
Yes.
ACE? What is
Mm-hmm.
the ACE?
Yeah. So the ACE study is adverse childhood experiences. It was a study that was done by Vincent Folletti that came out in 1998, I think, but was research all the way stemming back to the 80s. He actually ran an obesity clinic, and I won't go into the details of all the things, but basically what he found is that a large percentage of his patients were actually victims of childhood sexual abuse. And he started to draw connections between events that would happen in childhood that would then have an adverse effect, either mentally, physically, or both in their adult life. And it's one of the most kind of seminal research studies
Yeah.
still to this day, especially when we're talking about
And my
trauma.
husband's a pediatrician, and he totally uses this
Yes.
is very used now.
Yeah.
There's a
And
whole scale of possible adverse
yes.
childhood experiences, and then you come up with a score, based on
Yeah.
did you go through any of these things? Yeah.
Yes. And so it really was groundbreaking at the time. It still is. I think they're looking for ways to continue to expand it, to include more things as, as more research is coming out. But we really liked that model. We did differentiate a little bit, but really our working hypothesis was that the more adverse religious experiences you've had, the more likely it would that it be that it resulted in trauma and or other physical and mental health disorders or disease. Now, where we have a departure from the ACE study is they do have their 10 categories,
Yes.
right? And so if you had experienced 3 of them, then your ACE score is a 3. Or if you experience 8, your ACE score is an 8. So in that, the higher the score, the more likely for a long-term result. So we do agree with that. The more adverse religious experiences you have, the greater the likelihood of it resulting in trauma. But we also, 2 things, realize that just one adverse religious experience can result in trauma, and 100 adverse religious experiences may not result in trauma. So we wanted to leave some space there. And we also wanted to not categorize them the way that the ACE study does. So if you look at the ACE study, you won't see anything about like high control religion or cults. Yet we know that children who grew up in high control religion or cults absolutely are experiencing adversity. So there are some limitations there. We didn't want to put them in categories simply because we want people to have the freedom to be able to say, this was an adverse experience for me, even if it doesn't meet, these arbitrary categories that are decided. So it is giving people the ability to have that self-awareness and insight that was often taken away from them inside of a high control religion, and giving them permission to be able to kind of organize and name what it is that they've experienced. And in a lot of cases that they could realize that, yeah, it actually was that bad. I think of so many purity culture teachings that just destroyed people's sense of self-worth and increased the shame exponentially, even to the point where we're seeing, and this is backed by research now, like significant increase in like sexual pain disorders
That
and
was our research.
yeah, and sexual
Yeah.
dysfunction and
Yeah.
things like that, where
Yeah,
it's like,
because we found like vaginismus, we have about
yep,
2 to 2.5 times the rate of the general population. And
it's
the
yeah,
two biggest things that we found in our surveys are like believing the obligation sex message when you marry,
yes,
and
yes,
receiving the
mhm,
modesty message as a teenager in some form.
yes,
If you believe that you are at least partially responsible for a boy sinning, then your chance of vaginismus massively increases.
yes, yeah,
Yeah. There's
yeah,
also an increase if you wait for the wedding night, if you compare couples that only have sex with one person, which we think is because you're having sex for the first time unaroused, plus the obligation, like you don't have a choice now. So
yes,
we need to
yeah,
find ways to give women back autonomy
hmm,
and
yeah,
teach people about
yeah.
arousal, before they get married. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, we
Mhm.
see that then these things become extreme, like the impacts is very long lasting.
Mhm.
Like those messages bypass natural human development, the arousal cycle, just our
Mhm.
bodies being able to be prepared. And oftentimes, and this is not unequivocal, it's not every single time, but for a lot of women, especially when they go from saying, no, 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 and now it's yes on my wedding night, and so we do this thing that I'm supposed to do now because it's right. 3
Yeah.
hours ago it wasn't, but now it is, right?
Yeah.
Um our bodies oftentimes respond the same way that victims of sexualized violence
Mhm.
respond. So
Mhm.
we have even a lot of research there where we're seeing, okay, so, purity culture victims and survivors are matching sexual assault
Yeah,
survivors in terms of
and
impact.
I really do think
Yeah.
it's because of the lack of autonomy. You feel
Oh,
like you
for
have no
sure.
autonomy because, well,
Mhm.
now we're married, so I have to.
Yep.
And
Yes.
yeah, and so it
Yeah.
is, even if your husband isn't the one forcing you, you feel like you have to. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
it's just a, yeah,
Mhm.
really, really messy thing. So, okay, so
Mhm.
I have a
Yeah.
story for you. So in
Yeah.
your book, you talk about your own story, and I really like the way you handled it, because like you sort of
Mhm.
gave the big picture, but you didn't give like a ton of detail, because your point
Mhm.
was your story doesn't have to match mine,
Right.
right? Like
Yes. Yeah.
we all have our own stories, and it's not
Mhm.
like your story needs to look exactly the same
Right.
for it
Mhm.
to count as trauma. And,
Mhm.
as I've been thinking back on a lot of my experiences and how they've affected me, again, I don't have the one big thing,
Mhm.
but I have had some significant church hurt.
Mm.
And, I've shared this with the podcast before. A lot of it is just as we've been publishing our research, and the way that people that used to be my friends that I thought really loved Jesus, and that are writing
Mm.
books, don't care. They just
Yeah.
don't care that this stuff is
Ugh.
hurting women. And that's
Yeah.
really hard to deal with. But I
Mhm.
had an incident, and I would say this is probably, how old was Rebecca? Like, maybe like 2004, 2005. So almost 20 years ago now, okay?
Mhm.
And I was leading a praise team at an evangelical Baptist church. Um, and I had kind of taken over because I had been on a praise team, and then the leader, who was a guy, retired, and he told me I should just lead it. So I kind of stepped in. But then there were 4 praise teams in our church. This became a big thing, because is it okay for a woman to lead worship? And the first time that
Yes.
I led worship, I think between two of the songs, I said something like, as we're getting ready to sing this next song, I just invite you to take the worries of the week. And
Mm.
as we're picturing the cross, picturing putting them at the feet of Jesus, and just look up at Jesus. Okay. So I
Mm.
said something to that effect,
Yeah. Yeah.
before we sang the song, I See the Cross, or something. Okay.
Mhm.
And this became a really big thing to the deacons board, because was that
Interesting.
preaching? Did I
Ugh.
preach? And
Yeah.
so, first of all, am I allowed to lead worship? And then, if I do lead worship, am I allowed to
Mhm.
say these sentences between the songs, or
Mhm.
am I only allowed to sing?
Yeah.
And they debated this for a year. My husband was on the deacons board. He was really the only one arguing for me. There were others who thought I was doing a good job, but like they didn't know what they thought. And there were quite a few arguing against me being able to do this.
Mm.
But every month, because there was a 4-week rotation, I had to get up there and lead, knowing that
Yeah.
a
There's
lot of the
people. Yeah.
male leaders don't think that I should. And
Mm.
some of those deacons were actually other praise team leaders. Um, and it was really
Mm.
mess. And then the
Yeah.
conclusion they came to was that it would be okay if I led, as long as an elder or the pastor debriefed with me afterwards to make sure that I had done it correctly. And I said, well, do the men have to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know,
No, they don't. They sure
and they
don't.
finally just let me lead. Like they finally
Yeah.
gave it up and they
Yeah.
let me lead. But I had to go through that for a year
Mm. Yeah.
of,
It's
of that.
wild because that's unfortunately not uncommon, right? There's
Mhm.
so many women that share stories like that. And to the point where people are like, oh, yeah, that happened to me too. But I think when
Mhm.
you really sit down and like think about that, like the impact that something like that can have, it doesn't just go away now that this group of men said, okay, I guess it is okay that you say words, right?
Mhm.
Like there's so much impact, everything from shame and fear and hypervigilance and confusions and sense of betrayal and just, can I even trust myself? Am I a true believer? Am I sinning by doing this? Like there's so many
Mhm.
questions that can then, it doesn't just stop there. It then can carry over into other areas of your life
Yeah.
and or past that point.
I think for me, it was just that overwhelming feeling of the men here don't think that I'm as good
Yeah.
as they are. Like they think that I am a lesser person. They think that
Mhm.
God can't speak through me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that like I never thought I was sinning.
Yeah.
I know some people might get that.
Yeah.
I just thought how in the world can I believe that these are my brothers in Christ? Like I just
Yeah.
felt so betrayed. I felt
Yeah.
so betrayed and abandoned. Gosh, I'm getting
Yeah.
emotional. I don't even- No,
Oh,
but it does. It like
yeah.
yeah, it
It
does things.
really messes with people. I get that. And it's not okay.
Whew, yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
20 years, like,
Mhm.
it's not even a big thing. Like, that's the thing, and
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying, like, it's not even a
Yeah.
big thing, but it's like and let me give you another moment. Okay, I'm 18 years old, and I'm at a Bible college, a short-term Bible
Mhm.
college in England, going before I go to university, and so I just went so that I could spend a couple of months meeting new friends, and we had Bible classes in the mornings. I thought it would be wonderful. And one of the Bible classes, we were working through First Timothy, and we got to First Timothy 2. And
Mm.
I had already studied all the Greek for this. I had read a lot of the egalitarian resources. And so I wrote up a paper arguing that
Mhm.
the correct context for the verses that say, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man is actually better translated, that you don't permit a woman to usurp authority in and of
Mhm.
itself because the word there is only used once in scripture and it's like
Yeah.
well so I wrote all this out and I was talking there I had a serious crush on this guy. Okay, like a serious crush on this guy. And we had been flirting for like a month. And then I wrote this paper and he totally disagreed with me. And so I argued with him for a couple of days on it, like argued about, okay, well, how can you say that Paul doesn't want women to preach and women to teach when he actually likes Priscilla and Aquila? And he names Priscilla
Mhm.
first, which in the Greek was a way of saying she's the more,
Means something.
yeah,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, and finally I went and he said, you know what, you're right. I actually think you're probably right. And I actually think you're probably wrong. But I just can't listen to a woman teach. I wouldn't be able to take her seriously.
Yeah.
So he said that. And I felt like, well, I can't expect anything better from a Christian guy.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I wouldn't ever let, and when I got to university, it was the same thing. Like I wouldn't let anyone in my classes in a
Mhm.
secular university ever
Yes.
tell me that I couldn't do something. But when it
Mhm.
came to Christians, well, I mean, of course they're going to think that.
Yeah.
What can I
Yeah.
expect? What can I
Mhm.
expect? And it's that constant
Yeah.
that men outside of church treat me better than men inside of church.
Yeah.
And that I can't
That
expect the same thing, you know?
that was such a shock for me when I left my position at the church and I went and I worked at a community college and people started just respecting me because I did well at my job. And and men weren't coming up to me and being like, "Hey, you should button your shirt one more button," or, whatever.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they treated me like a human and it was not a wonderful job. I didn't love it, but it was such an eye opening because that truly, I mean, I would have been 24 or so, 24, 25. That was the first time I had a job not in a church or ministry setting. Up until that point, every single experience of my free time, of my service time, of my career was spent in that environment. And so then to have this experience outside of that, you're like, wait, you think I'm capable? I mean, okay. I mean, I would have to dumb myself down for the men I was with because I was told I was too intimidating. I knew too much. And I'm like, but you telling me, like read the Bible, study it, get to know it. I'm doing these things and I can run circles around these boys,
Right.
And now I'm being punished for that because I know more than they do, but now you're telling me that they see me as unattractive because I know more than them. And it was such a, like, still to this day, I get a little tentative around men where I'm like, I know more than you. And most of the men in my life are like, teach me, please, like, but there's
Yeah.
always, that's the long-term impact that we're talking about of like, there's always that little hiccup of like, are you going to look at me and tell me, that I need to be silent, because I am a woman, and that's hard. It's hard to deal with sometimes.
Yeah. And I think, when I look back, it's just over and over and over and over again, that attitude from the guy at Bible college, the attitude from the deacon's board, like every religious organization I was in, except for the one at my
Yeah.
secular university, which was awesome. So big
I
plug
love
and
it.
shout out for IVCF, and the IVCF groups on secular campuses. Like, yeah, every other religious organization I was in, very much, yeah, I had to be small, and there was something wrong with me because I was a woman. And that's just hard. Like, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard because, you feel like, does God really not love me as much because I'm a woman? But then even if you come to terms with that and you believe, no, wait a minute, this is just wrong. Like, God totally does love me and these people are just seeing God wrong. It's like, but then how is it that people who love God, people who know the Bible, how could they treat me this way?
Yeah.
And that's what actually is causing all of the angst and the stuff in your body now, is like, how can people who say that they love Jesus, how can they consistently treat people this way? I think
Yeah.
that's what I find hard to process still.
Yeah. There's so many people, I mean, clients and other people I've spoken to that they'll say, maybe it sounds cliche, but I think I know what they're saying. They'll say, as I was going through this like deconstruction process, I felt like I was following Jesus out the door because I'm pulling these things apart and I'm realizing, like, I've been taught about the life and character of Jesus. None of this other stuff matches over here. So now I have to choose between the church or the person the church is serving. Like, it's like, it can really kind of mess with you.
Yeah. And thankfully I landed in a church which does both. But
Yeah, there you go.
those
There you
can be
go.
hard. Those can be hard to find. And it doesn't, and just because you land in a church that does both, just even if people get in healthy places, it doesn't take away the pain that
Yes.
that everything else caused. So,
Yeah.
okay, here's another quote from page 43. You said this. You said, systems built on dynamics of power and control are abusive at their core. Within those systems is a hierarchy typically built on patriarchy. And then you go on to talk about how there's often a leader at the top and everything. And why is it that so much of the Christian church is built on power and control when Jesus told us the opposite? Maybe that's a theological question, but like, how has the church become so focused on power and control when Jesus told us it shouldn't be like that with you?
Yeah, that is a huge discussion. I mean, I have things I could definitely say about it. But there are certain areas where I feel like religious cultures and secular cultures are basically the same, and patriarchy is one of them. And I mean, kind of like their core tenets are the same. And the difference is that most churches with a patriarchal structure also say, and God said it is supposed to be this way. So then we get this ultimate authority that then, if you go against that, if you question that, that's questioning God. That's questioning, like, there could be eternal consequences to that. And when we get these structures of people that are in these positions of power and believe that they are speaking on behalf of God, we just keep going with the power. Like we just keep tightening those reins bit by bit. And suddenly God becomes a mirror image of me,
Yeah.
versus,
Yeah.
in a different way. And so I think that, at its core, if I go like, why does this exist in a church? This might sound weird, but I think there's a lot of fear that it's built on, of really, really wanting a sense of certainty, right and wrong. I want to know what I have to do in order to live the right way and to get the right reward. In this case, it would be heaven. I want to make sure that I don't burn in hell forever. And so if that means that I have these very narrow prescribed ways of living, I will do that. And I remember reading a book a long time ago talking about the origin of different religions and denominations, and how is it that, it's like this, a new denomination will be like, no, 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 that's not the way, it's this way. And another church will be like, no, 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 that's not the way, this way. And it's like this attempt to put enough parameters around it, enough like a box that you can go like, okay, just live inside this box. And if you do, you'll be godly, or you'll be living the right way. And if you do that, then you're okay and you're good and you will get this reward. And it's I really believe there's a fear underneath that, driving that, of like, I
Yeah.
don't want to be I don't want to be gone. I want to be here,
Yeah. And I think that's another thing that you've dealt with a lot is in the book, is how religion can actually create hypervigilance based on fear
Yes.
too.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. So when we're looking at like high control religion or fundamentalism, we're looking at ways of and patterns of thinking and relating. There's a lot of prescription. Here's the things that you do or say. Here's what you don't do. Here's what you don't say. Here's who is okay. Who's not okay. It's very binary and
Hmm.
dual. I think it's called dualistic. So it's this way or it's that way, right
Hmm.
or wrong, good or bad. Everything is categorized. And any, you obviously are in the good column, so anybody outside of that or not living according to that is bad or wrong or evil or sinful or whatnot. That in and of itself can give a little bit of a sense of safety or an illusion of safety, because I'm in the good column, I'm in the right
Hmm.
column, this is good. But it also is a lot of hypervigilance, because I'm constantly having to do more and more and more to make sure that I'm continuing to fit whatever that mold is. And that can sometimes change from person to person, because this person says, oh, God wants you to be like this. And this other person says, well, no, God wants you to be like this. And so now it's in therapy terms, we call that an external locus of control, where I'm looking to all these other people to tell me and what I'm doing okay, which then means I'm okay. That's a very anxious spot to live in. And yet that is how we are invited to live in a high control religion. I was terrified of making a mistake when I was growing up. Any mistake, I was constantly berating myself and critical, and terrified that if I made a mistake and somebody saw it, that was going to be even worse. Because now not only have I sinned, but somebody saw me sin. Maybe they're
Hmm.
stumbling because of my sin. I've got to repent. I've got to go through the process of restoration for any mistake that I may have made. And that is just, that's it. Like, I can even remember, even as I'm saying that, I'm like, oh, my shoulders are rising. And I'm like, oh, I remember the terror of standing in front of my closet and being like, what shirt should I wear? And oh, what if I make a mistake? And that could
Hmm.
lead to a life of singleness,
Yeah.
and it sounds so extreme. And yet that is how a lot of high control religions
Hmm.
operate.
Yeah. That's so
Mm.
true. And of course, then, yeah. And then, like you said, your shoulders go up, like that lives in the body, like
Yes.
hypervigilance lives
Yeah.
in the body. And it means that
Yes.
you're always on and the
Hmm.
adrenaline's always there. And that's a
Yeah.
terrible way to live. It's
Yeah.
just, yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
And speaking of the body, a large part of your book, like you spend, the first few chapters just talking about the problem of trauma, why, what trauma can look like in high control religious environments, et cetera. But then you do talk about like how to move forward and how to get over, which is
Mhm.
great.
Mhm.
And a lot of that is body work, and how to feel comfortable in your body again, and how not to treat your body like an enemy. Um,
Yes.
can you
Mhm.
tell me about that? Why do we do that?
Yeah. I really believe like our body has so much knowledge, so much wisdom. Um, with that, it's hard to separate even like body and sexuality. And I don't mean like whose genitals are smashing into one another.
Mhm,
I mean like the essence of who we are as a sexual being.
mhm,
Um, those are such important pieces, so such intricate pieces to who we are, the essence of who we are. And that is powerful. Like, that's a powerful thing that could be very scary to people who are trying to control you.
mhm,
And so when we take away and we cut things off and we say this is bad, this is sinful, this is evil, this is wrong, that could be just kind of the essence of who we are, our innate sexuality, our body. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I heard like your body is evil, your body needs to be made a slave to Christ, ignore your body, right?
mhm,
We're taught all these things, which means we're cutting off valuable sources of information, of knowing, of making meaning, of connection, all of these things. And that actually makes somebody easier to control. If I tell somebody, from the neck down, you can't trust any of that. And then I
mhm,
have, I don't know, like my stomach growls. Well, I can't even trust to know that I'm hungry because
mhm,
that's part of this sinful flesh bag that I'm living in, right? And so so I really believe then healing it's like a very integrative process. Like, yes, we do need to cognitively untangle certain beliefs and understand what things mean. And do I actually believe that? Are those my values? We just have to take it further than that and move down into our body, be reconnected to our body, listening to our body, knowing that our body is a source of being able to experience pleasure and connection. And
mhm.
when we do that, like we have access to like a whole self. And I think that truly is where healing is. It's like a reintroduction to self and being able to lean into our goodness that is within us. And I think that oftentimes starts in the body because that's where we're cut off.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
I loved your analogy, when you were talking about sex, of the dimmer switch versus the on-off switch.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you tell me about that? And how have you seen that in your
Yes.
practice?
Yeah. So my practicum and internship for my master's degree, I actually worked with sex offenders, convicted adult and juvenile sex offenders. And I mean, I knew nothing about
Mhm,
sex or sex education because I had abstinence only education growing up. Um, and I was supposed to do sex ed with the juvenile sex offenders and their parents because um, most of them were victims of sexual assault as well, and all the things. And
mhm,
somebody gave me this analogy, and I modified it a bit, and it works. But the analogy is this: is that our sexuality is innate from the time we are born. We are sexual beings.
mhm,
Um, and so it's much bigger than who are we having sexual intercourse with. It is part of
mhm,
who we are. And so from the moment we are born, it's there. And I use the analogy of like like a dimmer switch where you can like slowly turn it up and it can get brighter. And that I believe is how our sexuality is supposed to work. Like how our sexual like
mhm,
leaning into who we are as a sexual being, how that looks with other people, engaging in sexual activity. And so when we're 3 or 4, that's going to look like a lot of curiosity and exploration. When we're 13, 14, that's when our hormones are starting to rage through our
mhm,
body, and there's a different kind of curiosity and exploration. That's where we're introduced to pleasure. And if we look at sexual development in that way, then by the time that we are ready to engage with sex with a partner, our bodies are ready for that. We are
mhm,
engaged with our sexual selves. Now, the difference though is that okay, we have dimmer switches. We also
Mhm.
have on off light switches, right? And so when we suppress our sexuality, suppress, make it evil, vilify it, turn it
Mhm.
off, turn it off, turn it off. And then we are supposed to say, oh, now I said I do. So it's
Mhm.
good. Okay. Then it's like turning the switch on. Our body is not prepared for that. And that's where we start to see some of the long-term impact, like we were talking about before, of people's bodies literally freezing up. We're seeing vaginismus. We're seeing sexual pains, sexual dysfunction. We're seeing a lot of shame and guilt, and people that are extremely confused because they're like, I kept everything off until I was allowed to turn it on, and my body is freaking out. And that's
Mhm.
also very similar in like childhood sexual abuse survivors as well, where it's like where they're at developmentally. If they're sexually abused, it is like a light switch being turned on, because where they're like developmentally, biologically, psychologically,
Mhm.
is not at the same level as what is being done to them. And so that's where we start to see that we've got the 5-year-old who's like extremely sexually active, even though biologically that's not really
Mhm.
where they should be at. And
Mhm.
so our bodies, the way our nervous system responds to that really is threat and danger. And that's where we do start to see some of this long-term impact, like with the research that you're doing. Like that's a nervous system response that we should not necessarily have to go through, because our body sees that as threatening and as dangerous, instead of being able to naturally turn
Mhm.
that on. That on off switch, that's the too much, too fast, too soon. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what we try to do. Like in our books, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex and Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex, we really did try to introduce that
Yeah.
concept of like it's not an on-off. Like, let's learn the arousal
Yes.
cycle. Let's,
Mhm.
let's do this,
Yeah.
properly, so that you don't just jump and it is too much too soon, because it is overwhelming. It's
Yeah.
I think the most common word we heard from women in our survey about their wedding night, if they waited, was bewildering. Like what a
Oh,
horrible word.
yeah. Yeah.
And yet
That's
that's what
not,
people
yeah.
said over and over again, was
Mhm.
bewildering. And so we're doing something
Yeah.
really wrong. We got to figure this out.
Yeah. I remember years and years ago, one of the first couples that I ever worked with, where I was like, oh, this is really, really harmful. I'd already done a lot of deconstruction by that point. And this couple came in, just tears running down their face. They'd been married for maybe 2 years at most. And they were like, we did it exactly how we were supposed to. We didn't even kiss until our wedding
Mhm.
day. And we were promised that if we did this, here's going to be these results. And they're like, it's been awful, just
Mhm.
truly, truly awful. And they were really just extremely disconnected, and just uh, on the borderline of like hating one another because of how much shame they felt about themselves and the entire situation. And they were bewildered, because they were like, this is not what was told to
Mhm.
us. We were supposed to be able to have all these other things because we did it right. And it's like that story is unfortunately common, like
Mhm.
extremely common.
Yeah, it really
Yeah.
is. It really is. So let me tell you what I
Yeah.
really appreciated, Laura, in your book is just you putting words and validation,
Mhm.
I think, to what a lot of people are going through. Because I know I hear from people all the time, on social media channels and where that there's just been a lot of church hurt, especially from
Yeah.
women who have had to
Yeah.
escape destructive marriages and the way the church has treated
Mhm.
them, or just women growing up in church like I did, and just feeling like
Mhm.
you're never good enough, you're always less than, your voice is too loud, you need to make yourself smaller, you're a
Yeah.
problem. Um, it wears on you. And yet
Mhm.
and then you start feeling like, I can't even go to church. I am so stressed every Sunday morning. I am so stressed. I wake
Yeah.
up with a headache, my heart's pounding.
Mm.
And you're like, why is this happening? I love Jesus. And then you start the self-blame, like,
Mm.
what, do you not want to go worship? And
Mhm.
I think just giving words to people and saying, yeah, like when you're in an
Yeah.
environment that looks like this, your body
Mhm.
can feel too much too soon, too fast,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
just overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
so giving words to that you're not crazy if your body, if
No.
your heart's racing, if you're getting the
Yeah.
stomach aches, if you're getting the headaches, if you're
Yeah.
if you're finding yourself
Mhm.
tensing up. Um, you're not crazy. There's something happening, and being able to identify that and work through that, and and even just getting integrated with your body again, I thought was really helpful. So thank you for giving words to that to people. I really appreciate it. So again, yes, the book is When Religion Hurts You by Laura Anderson. It was just out. When did it release? Early November, late October?
October 17th.
October 17th.
Yep, mid-October.
Okay.
Yeah.
So about a month and a half
It's
ago.
still new.
Yeah, it's still new. But you can pick it up. We will put links in the podcast notes where you can get it, When Religion Hurts You. And where can people find you, Laura?
Yeah, I'm on all social media platforms at Dr. Laura E. Anderson.
Okay.
And that's my website as well, drlauraeanderson.com. So that's where you can go to find all the things I do, the podcasts that I host, the Substack, coaching, they're like all the things, consultations. So, and there's also links to the book. We do have a little kind of fun incentive that if you read the book and you leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads, you can screen grab that, upload it into the website, and you'll get some free resources just as a thank you for doing that.
Okay, well, I will put a link to that too, where people can find out about that. That is wonderful. So thank you for doing this work, and thank you for helping make the church healthier, because we need that. It's not an anti-church thing. It's a let's get back to what's healthy and what's whole and what's good. So I appreciate that so much.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Bare Marriage Podcast. I hope that this conversation with Laura was encouraging, validating, and hopeful for those of you who have struggled with church hurt or spiritual abuse in your past. As always, if you want to check out anything that we discussed in this podcast, you can find it in the show notes or in the blog post that goes along with this, which I believe is also linked in the show notes. And if you enjoy this podcast, could you please rate it 5 stars? It helps us a ton. I can't even tell you how much it helps us, but it really does. We appreciate all of you who've already done that. And we thank in advance everyone who decides to now. But until next time, thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Bye.